Hello, YouTube. Sidekick here. Welcome to another episode of 70 Years of Moving Mud, the History of Iron Bombing podcast. This is episode 17, Down the Slippery Slope, which refers to the gradual way in which the United States got itself involved in another shooting war in Asia. Now, I emphasize the another there, but, I probably could have said got involved again in the war in Asia, because there's an awful lot of similarities between the war in Vietnam and the war in Korea. And even though we think of them as separate events, they're also really part of a larger geopolitical story. And this fact seems to be underappreciated in most of the modern coverage of the conflict, at least what I have read. And it certainly was not appreciated by the United States or the West at the time of the United States military involvement in Vietnam. But here's the key. It was recognized by the United States as adversaries. And this is a critical issue that many people don't understand, and I think it's actually at the heart of much of what happened, and in fact, how it's been seen ever since. So I'm going to spend a bit of time on that here, because it's an argument that's kind of crucial to my whole view of what happened in Vietnam, and right down to how the air power was used, and even how it was designed to be used. So bear with me on this journey just a little, and let's take a look at the two conflicts in Vietnam and Korea. We'll look at Vietnam when the U.S. was involved and Korea when the U.S. was involved. Now, actually, both conflicts started at the same time. The conflict in Vietnam started in the late 1940s and early 50s as a conflict between the French and the Vietnamese, not the United States. Now, so it's often not recognized as being part of the same conflict that the U.S. was involved in, but it was, and anyone in Vietnam would not make the mistake of thinking that it wasn't. Now, both Korea and Vietnam were an outgrowth of the colonial history of Asia and the distrust of Asian countries for Western powers, which they saw, with some justification, as imperialists bent on continuing to prevent Asian countries from claiming their rightful place. This resentment fueled the rise and popularity of communism across the region, as capitalism was widely seen as being synonymous with corruption and dispossession of the actual local people. Again, not without some justification, frankly. Both conflicts were the result of political maneuvering after the Second World War and the growth of the Cold War that led the world to be divided into spheres of influence between the West and the communist bloc. Both conflicts consisted of one side that was utterly committed to reuniting their country under the communist sphere, and the other side that was seeking only to prevent that from happening, and which was not really committed or even really interested in fully conquering the other side. This dramatic asymmetry in war aims is one of the fundamental issues we'll need to discuss. In Korea, this asymmetry was there, but it wasn't as obvious. In Vietnam, the communist side had learned how to exploit this asymmetry to its advantage, partly because they had been thwarted in Korea and they were not interested in repeating that event. The Western side, on the other hand, failed to appreciate the importance of the asymmetry and its ramifications, in large part because they kind of felt like they'd won in Korea, or at least fought to an acceptable conclusion. Now, both conflicts consisted of one protagonist with a sophisticated modern military based increasingly on firepower instead of manpower, and which was developing techniques for focusing that firepower to a greater and greater effect, requiring, it was hoped, less and less manpower. On the other side was a protagonist that was far less developed economically and militarily, that relied heavily on manpower rather than modern firepower, and which was completely at home with this trade-off, by the way, and quite willing to sell many lives cheaply in order to cause a smaller number of casualties on the other side, because they knew that those smaller number of casualties would have a greater impact, especially over time. Now, the side relying on firepower also assumed that the adversary's infrastructure and economy would be susceptible to being dismantled with firepower, and that, if it operated like that person's economy, it would not be resilient to those effects. The other side, on the other hand, learned rapidly that their economy and infrastructure was less developed, but it was also far more resilient to being dismantled because of that, particularly because it relied not on expensive and difficult to replace technology, but on relatively cheap manual labor and easily available natural resources. So in that last discussion, I used the word learned, and it's actually a really important one to think about, because the point was that the communist side viewed Korea and Vietnam as part of a single conflict, and lessons from one were passed around and learned by all. By the time the United States was getting involved militarily in Vietnam, its ways and means were well understood by its adversary, and new strategies and tactics were constantly being developed to counter those ways and means. The United States, on the other hand, as the common combatant in both wars, actually learned very little, or rather applied very little of the lessons from one to the other. Now, there are probably a lot of reasons for this, and they probably all interact with one another. I certainly haven't done enough research to be confident about what they were. I do think that there are certain things that stand out. One is that, in part, this lack of learning was frankly complacency. The U.S. felt that it had fought the other side to a draw in Korea, which was an acceptable conclusion and continues to be after 70 years. So it didn't really see the need to alter its tactics from that conflict. I think some of the lack of learning had to do with the changing of political and military guard in the United States as well. The Korean War was fought by, effectively, World War II veterans, both on the ground and in political leadership. Vietnam was fought by a new generation, both in Washington and on the ground. For a bunch of reasons, which would take several episodes to cover, there wasn't a lot of corporate knowledge transfer from one of those generations to the next, at least not as much as one would have hoped. When the transfer did take place, as it did in the military, it mainly consisted of teaching the methods that had supposedly worked in Korea, rather than analyzing why they had not been as effective as they could have been. Now, in contrast, the leadership of the main players on the other side, the communist players, meaning Vietnam, China, Korea, and the USSR, that leadership was largely constant all the way from World War II and its aftermath through the Civil War in China, the Korean conflict, the French Indochinese War, and the Vietnamese Civil War that it spawned. The United States' ability to learn from its experience in Korea and in conflict with China was hampered in particular by a political climate that viewed the result of the Chinese Civil War as a catastrophic political defeat and the Korean War as a military rescue of a political strategy that had gone badly wrong. Thus, many of the old China hands of U.S. diplomacy were discredited and ignored in the run-up or slide down to Vietnam, while many of the military veterans were promoted, often into diplomatic posts, based basically on the perception that they had actually been the victors in Korea. But really, had they? The Korean War, really consisted of multiple phases, each of which revealed different aspects of the two opponents. The first phase, in which South Korean and U.S. forces were pretty much overrun and nearly ejected from the peninsula, actually, in the end, demonstrated the value of massive firepower over manpower, because once firepower was brought into theater, along with the means of targeting it accurately, it effectively blunted the initial Korean advantage in manpower. The second phase, where the UN broke out of its enclave and staged the daring amphibious landing in Incheon, showed the value of sophisticated intelligence, firepower, and the logistics to support it. The United Nations threw the North Korean forces almost the way back to the Chinese border. Although that had not been the original political goal, that was a military goal. But then it found out what a real massive advantage in manpower is truly worth, particularly when it's combined with stealth and deception, negating the advantage of firepower because that firepower is denied the ability to acquire targets at sufficient range to be truly effective. And so the United Nations was thrown back to where the whole thing started, and the conflict evolved into positional warfare, where frankly it stayed for 70 years. As a result, the military lesson of Korea that seems to have been that the U.S. had been successful at finding a solution to the problem posed by the Chinese invasion, because the strategy and tactics that they employed did blunt that invasion, and then it threw the Chinese back to the 38th parallel after they'd progressed a little farther than that, and so that seemed like success. Significantly, and not surprisingly, the approach that was used to do that was actually kind of similar to what had been used during the Second World War, at least against Nazi Germany. And that strategy was basically degrade the enemy's economy and infrastructure, isolate the active theater by attacking transportation leaks, further isolate the battlefield by interdicting movement of supplies and reinforcements just behind the forward edge of battle area, and deploy firepower that can be concentrated quickly and effectively at the point of impact. And it was successful, to a point. I mean, I would argue that the approach follows a weird kind of inverse square law. The closer to the front, the more effective it was, but as you move farther back, it actually became less and less effective. The ability to concentrate firepower and to isolate sections of the battlefield with it was effective, both at cutting off enemy offensive action and restoring any local dislocation that was caused through targeted counterattacks. The isolation, though, was not as complete as it had been in Germany, owing to the fact that the enemy was not mechanized, and so not restricted to using roads even to move supplies. Targets were far softer, smaller, and more diffuse, which negated the advantage of the concentrated firepower. Similarly, attempts to isolate the whole combat theater were even more ineffective. I mean, at no time did communist troops lack for the basic necessities the way the German troops in Normandy had. Again, because it was much less sophisticated, the North Korean transportation infrastructure proved to be far more resilient than Germany's had been. It was also, again, diffuse and soft. No matter how hard the United States Air Force and Navy hit that marshmallow, it always absorbed the blow and eventually came back to more or less where it had been, often in a frighteningly short period of time and at a frighteningly large cost in airplanes and aircrew. And finally, the attempts to ruin North Korea's economic infrastructure, such as it was, were largely successful and largely ineffective. It had been said that by 1953 there were hardly any buildings higher than one story left in North Korea, but that did not prevent life and economic life from continuing. In large measure, this was because much of the required manufactured goods for the economy could be obtained from China, just across the border. And the one place where U.S. air superiority was significantly challenged and maybe even prevented was in the Yalu Valley, which protected those critical links. In short, the U.S. approach gave good results in the part of the conflict where soldiers on the ground could see it. But it was much less effective where they could not, because those very soldiers ended up leading U.S. efforts in Vietnam. Operationally, strategically, and diplomatically, this was really important. The whole experience also taught the Koreans, Chinese, and Russians that against the overwhelming advantage in firepower, the effective strategy was to present a diffuse and resilient target, but also to pick some very few areas in which that dominance could be challenged. And thus you force your opponent to spend resources everywhere, while spending your own in a very specific area where you can compete. And then you force the opponent to spend even more resources when you escalate that effort. These two contrasting lessons learned experiences were to play out in Vietnam in ways that the United States would find much less palatable than they had in Korea. And honestly, these results were maybe even less easy to accept, even to this day, at least in certain circles. But we won't go into that too much today. Let's just say at this point that sets the stage in terms of where both sides were after the conclusion of hostilities in Korea and before the outbreak of the U.S. portion of the Vietnam conflict. So now let's go back and take a quick look at the history of how things developed. So say from 1953 to 1965, which, let's call that when the U.S. military involvement in Vietnam really turned it from an insurgency into an all-out civil war between the South and the North. Now, if you're looking for historical context for the conflict in Vietnam, you can go an awful long way back. Vietnam has a very turbulent history that goes back centuries, but I'm going to go back really just as far as the Second World War. During World War II, Vietnam entered the conflict as a colony of France, and it continued to be ruled by the French even after the French lost the war to the Germans. But they were eventually supplanted and then displaced by the Japanese, who took over occupation. The effect of the Japanese occupation was similar to what it was in all of the territories they occupied. They were, frankly, brutal and oppressive, but they weren't European. And it was not lost on the people of Vietnam that the Japanese early victories over the Western forces deflated the myth of Western superiority that the colonial powers had been so careful to cultivate for centuries. So at the end of the war, many Vietnamese expected that the Allies would make good on promises that they'd been made at various times of self-determination for all peoples. But it was not to be, at least not in Vietnam. The French, bruised as they were by their defeat in 1940, were hungry to reestablish their prestige which now largely rested on having an overseas empire, which was the mark of a great power. There were lots of toings and froings at the very end of the war, but let's just leave it as the French reestablished both their rule and their discriminatory practices in Vietnam. Now, the opposition was not slow in coming. It was centered on the Vietnamese Communist Party and their military arm, the Viet Minh, the leader of which was Ho Chi Minh. Now, the history of Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party makes entertaining reading, but it would take too long to explore here. Let's just really highly summarize it by saying that Ho Chi Minh was no fan at all of the Western powers, having been, he believed, with some justification, misled, ignored, and eventually sold out after the First World War when he arrived in Paris in 1919, expecting Woodrow Wilson, in particular, to make good on the promise of self-determination, but instead was treated as a second-class member of a second-class race by pretty much everyone. As a consequence, he gravitated not only to communism, but to the USSR in particular, where he was met with much more respect and offered much more assistance in the struggle against imperialism. By the end of the Second World War, he was not only a committed communist, but actually an ardent Stalinist and dedicated disciple of the Russian dictator. He was, on the other hand, no great fan of Mao Zedong and the Communist Party of China, in some measure because the Chinese also had a history as a colonial power in Vietnam, and because, frankly, the Chinese nationalist forces had actually occupied part of North Vietnam in the wake of Japanese surrender. So this animosity between the Viet Minh and the Chinese was one of the features of the situation in Vietnam that was kind of missed by Western diplomats, and it would lead to some pretty serious miscalculations, but we'll get to that much later. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh declared that Hanoi was now the capital of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. This claim was actually tacitly acknowledged by the Chinese occupation forces in the north, but rejected by the Western powers. In 1946, the French, building off a base in the south that had been established under British administration, threw the Viet Minh out of Hanoi and reimposed their colonial rule. This was followed by 3 years of increasingly pervasive insurgency, with the French holding the urban areas and the Viet Minh dominating rural areas, particularly in the north. By late 1949 and early 1950, the conflict had escalated into a full conventional conflict, with the French being supplied by the U.S. and the Viet Minh being supplied by the Soviets and from China. So, as the U.S. was drawn into a protracted conflict in Korea involving well-armed but relatively low-tech communist forces, the French were finding the same thing in Vietnam. Unfortunately, France did not have the depth of technological or financial resources to apply the overwhelming firepower that the U.S. Had, and which was fundamental to the U.S. strategy in Korea. And while the U.S. and the UN were able to fight the Koreans and the Chinese to a bloody draw, in Korea the French were soundly defeated in Vietnam in a conflict that culminated in the encirclement and surrender of more than 10,000 troops at Dien Bien Phu. The loss was a military tragedy of hubris and poor planning, but it was also a politically catastrophic embarrassment before the whole world. The French government resigned and was replaced by another that immediately opened peace negotiations in Geneva with the Viet Minh, but actually not only with the Viet Minh. The negotiations in Geneva were part of a larger international peace conference designed to resolve not only the conflict in Vietnam, but Korea as well. So the conference included delegations from the USSR, from China, the USA, the UK, as well as France and Vietnam. The Viet Minh and their communist backers pushed hard for a united Vietnam, but this was strongly resisted by the US and the UK in particular. In the end, the country was divided into North and South zones, with the Viet Minh in power in the north and a government led by the former Emperor Bao Dai in power in the south. The accord provided for the country to be reunited 2 years later through elections across the whole country. The Viet Minh assumed that since they would be able to control the vote in the north, which was more populous than the south, then they would win it, and so they readily agreed to the plan. The U.S. was unwilling to see another Asian domino toppled in the war against communism and refused to support the accord, and, in fact, so did the state of Vietnam, meaning South Vietnam. This set the stage for the next 20 years of conflict, basically. The final touches on the picture were completed in 1955 when the government of Ngo Dinh Diem held a referendum to allow the people of South Vietnam to choose between his government and the former emperor. With, it is widely assumed, the tacit and overt support of the CIA, the Diem government engineered a landslide victory and declared the Republic of Vietnam, which then immediately renounced the peace accords. The Viet Minh in the north instructed their members, who remained in South Vietnam, to take up active resistance against the government under the new label, the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, known to history as the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong began an active insurgency against the Diem government. At first, this was not actually actively supported by the North, but that changed in 1959. The U.S. attempted to support Diem as a bulwark against the communists. They tried and failed to get the Diem government to enact land reform with programs to pay large landowners to relinquish land for use by landless peasants. Unfortunately, the Diem government had no real interest in these reforms, or in democracy at all, really. The Diems were staunchly Roman Catholic, as well as most of their supporters. They were Roman Catholics because they had been the moneyed elite of the country during French colonial times. They had used their status with the French to concentrate wealth and political power in their class while denying both to the largely Buddhist peasants. The Diem government continued the repression of the Buddhists and the rural peasants alike, along with the Viet Cong. The result was a gradual and then rapid erosion of support for the Diem government in the rural areas and, crucially, also in Washington. This process accelerated when the North announced full-throated support for the Viet Cong in 1959, with the attendant increase in both personnel and equipment transferred to the South, along a route that bypassed the border between North and South by following jungle trails in neighboring Laos. This route, or actually collection of routes, would become known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. More on that later. The process of the downfall of Diem then accelerated even more rapidly when the Eisenhower administration was replaced by that of John F. Kennedy in the election of 1960. The new men of the Kennedy administration had very little time for Diem and his continuation, largely, of French colonial rule by another name. The U.S. military advisors who were sent to observe the National Army of Vietnam in action were appalled at the incompetence and corruption that they encountered. Their reports back to Washington confirmed the feeling that the Diem administration was living on borrowed time and that it was losing the war with the North through arrogance, greed, and incompetence. In November 1963, the U.S. supported a coup by General Duong Van Minh, which resulted in the assassination of Diem. That assassination had not been in the U.S. plan. They had been expecting Diem to be captured and kept alive. The result, though, was a massive loss in credibility both for the Saigon government and the U.S. policy of supporting it. This was not helped by the abject incompetence of Minh, who himself was deposed in a coup barely 3 months later, all of which handed significant leverage to the Viet Cong and accelerated the insurgency in most rural areas of the country. The U.S. was now faced with a situation where the regime that they had put in place and needed as a bulwark to the communist incursion had neither the political capital nor the military capacity to do the job. But The U.S. still felt that it was an existential problem that the communist incursion had to be stopped. You have to understand this about the climate of the time. Having just come through the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the safety and security of U.S. citizens on U.S. soil was seriously threatened for the first time since, the American Civil War, the U.S. was convinced it was in a fight to the finish with communism, and that they could not afford to cede any territory anywhere to their adversary. And unfortunately, having backed the regime in South Vietnam for nearly a decade, and having held them up as a model of democracy and the free world, there was no way that the U.S. could extract themselves and see that regime taken down by communists without suffering a massive loss in international prestige. And as far as the U.S. was concerned at the time, it was just this international prestige which was the key to holding the coalition of freedom-loving peoples together in the face of communist propaganda and subversion. In other words, there really didn't seem to be any other choice than to throw even more weight behind the generals in South Vietnam. So the U.S. began providing more and more assistance to the Republic of Vietnam in the form of financial support as well as increasing military assistance. More and more military advisors arrived in Vietnam to help the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, as it was now called. More and more they concluded that this was not an organization that could defeat the enemy it faced. And the calls began by those military representatives for the U.S. to provide more than just military supplies and advice, but actual combat power. And already the slippery slope suddenly became much, much steeper and much slipperier, and the descent of U.S. policy into all-out armed conflict accelerated dramatically and irrevocably from there. So that's a very quick trip down that slippery slope from 1950 to 1963, 65. But I think I'm going to leave it there. There is obviously a lot more to talk about. In the next episode, having set the history, we'll start looking at how particularly the U.S. Air Forces, where they were and how they were prepared for the conflict in Vietnam. So if you want to know more about that, tune in for the next episode of 70 Years of Moving Mud, a History of Iron Bombing podcast. For now, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.